When a billionaire witnessed a homeless girl protecting his daughter, what he did next changed everything. Maxwell Reed had built an empire worth billions. But in one moment, he witnessed something his money could never buy: pure courage in the face of nothing to gain. What happened next would not only change the homeless girl's life forever, it would shatter the foundations of Maxwell's carefully constructed world and force him to confront the true cost of success. But this story isn't just about wealth and poverty colliding. It's about a reckoning that would transform 3 lives in ways no one could have imagined. Maxwell Reed stepped out of his Bentley, checking his watch impatiently. His driver was supposed to pick up Lily from her elite private school 20 minutes ago, but a flat tire had forced him to make the trip himself. As the 52-year-old tech billionaire approached the school gates, something caught his eye. There, in the shadow of the ornate school entrance, his 12-year-old daughter was cornered by 3 older girls. Lily, painfully shy and small for her age, clutched her books to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Maxwell quickened his pace, but before he could reach her, something unbelievable happened. A teenage girl in tattered clothes and worn-out sneakers stepped between Lily and her tormentors. "Back off," she growled, her thin frame somehow commanding. "Pick on someone who can fight back." "Who do you think you are, street trash?" One of the bullies sneered, eyeing the girl's patched jacket and unwashed hair. What happened next left Maxwell frozen in his tracks. The homeless girl didn't flinch. Instead, she looked the bully directly in the eyes and said, "I'm someone with nothing to lose, are you?" The threat in her voice was unmistakable, and remarkably, the bullies retreated. As Maxwell finally reached them, the homeless girl was already walking away. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes. "She saved me, Dad. She didn't even know me." Maxwell stared after the retreating figure, noticing the holes in her shoes and the way she limped slightly. He had built an empire by recognizing value where others saw nothing. But what he witnessed that day would haunt him for weeks and force him to question everything he thought he knew about worth. For 3 days, Maxwell couldn't shake the image of the homeless girl who had defended Lily. Something about her fierce dignity and the intelligence in her eyes didn't align with her circumstances. "Jenkins," he called his head of security into his home office. "I need you to find someone." Within 48 hours, a file landed on Maxwell's desk. Her name was Zoe Winters, 17 years old. What Maxwell read next made his stomach tighten. 2 years ago, Zoe had been a straight-A student with a full scholarship to a prestigious STEM program. Her single mother had worked at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a company that Maxwell's tech conglomerate had acquired and subsequently restructured. Her mother had been among the thousands laid off. 6 months later, she died of an illness she couldn't afford to treat without health insurance. Zoe had bounced between distant relatives and foster homes before ending up on the streets. Even then, she had continued attending school whenever possible, using public library computers to complete assignments, until the system finally failed her completely. "Sir," Jenkins said, "there's more. She's been sleeping in an abandoned building 3 blocks from Miss Lily's school. Apparently, she still tries to audit classes sometimes, sits outside open windows of the community college nearby." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, a strange feeling washing over him. He had restructured dozens of companies, never once considering the human cost beyond abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. Efficiency, optimization, shareholder value. These were the principles that had built his fortune. "She's quite remarkable," Jenkins continued, uncharacteristically emotional. "The local shelter director says she tutors younger homeless kids in math, says she could have been anything." Maxwell stared at the grainy security camera photo of Zoe. The girl who had nothing had given protection to his daughter, who had everything. But what Maxwell didn't know was that Zoe's connection to his life ran deeper than he could have imagined. Maxwell sat in his car across from the abandoned building where Zoe reportedly stayed. Rain pounded the windshield as he wrestled with his conscience. He had come armed with a solution, a check large enough to change her life, a scholarship to any university, and connections to place her wherever she wanted to go. Simple, clean, a transaction to ease his guilt. The neighborhood around him bore little resemblance to the pristine streets where he conducted business. Boarded storefronts, crumbling infrastructure, and desperate faces told a story that never appeared in his quarterly reports. Maxwell checked his watch, a Swiss timepiece worth more than what most people here would earn in years. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he finally spotted her slipping through a broken side door, he stepped out into the downpour. The cold rain immediately penetrated his cashmere coat, a discomfort he rarely experienced in his climate-controlled existence. "Zoe," he called, his voice nearly drowned by the storm. She turned, instantly wary, her body language shifting to defensive. Recognition flashed in her eyes, not fear, but something harder, more resolute. "You're the father of that girl from Westlake Academy." "I am. Maxwell Reed." He extended his hand, which she didn't take. Water streamed down his face as he stood there, arm outstretched, experiencing an unfamiliar sensation. Powerlessness. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for my daughter." "I didn't do it for thanks." Her voice was steady despite the rain soaking through her thin jacket. Maxwell noticed her shoulders were hunched against the cold, but her gaze remained unflinching. "Nobody was helping her. I know what that feels like. Nevertheless, I'd like to help you." He reached into his coat, producing an envelope protected in plastic. "This should cover education, housing, whatever you need to." "To what? Disappear with a clean conscience?" Her eyes flashed with an intelligence that pierced through his practiced corporate veneer. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Reed? Did you even bother to find out before coming here with your checkbook?" Maxwell hesitated, raindrops collecting on his eyelashes. The girl before him couldn't be more than 17, yet she spoke with the weary wisdom of someone who had seen the underside of American prosperity. "I know about your mother, about Meridian Pharmaceuticals." "Then you know you're the reason I'm standing here." Her voice didn't waver, though her lips had begun to turn slightly blue from the cold. "Your optimization strategy put 5,000 people out of work. My mother died because she couldn't afford medication after losing her health insurance. She worked for your company for 15 years. 15 years of loyalty repaid with a pink slip and a pathetic severance package that barely covered 2 months' rent." The rain seemed to grow heavier as Maxwell stood speechless. Around them, the dilapidated buildings and cracked sidewalks suddenly seemed like monuments to his failure. Not as a businessman, but as a human being. "I don't want your money," Zoe continued, pushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "But there are hundreds of families still suffering from what your company did. People who lost homes, who can't afford medical care. Mrs. Diaz, 3 buildings down. Her husband worked in your warehouse. He had a heart attack 6 weeks after being laid off. No insurance. Now she cleans houses 7 days a week to pay off medical debt she'll never escape." She gestured to the building behind her. "The Patels on the 2nd floor. Their father worked in quality control at Meridian for a decade. Now he drives Uber 18 hours a day while their mother takes night shifts at a convenience store. Their daughter, who had a full scholarship to MIT, had to drop out to help support the family. Each example landed like a physical blow. Maxwell had faced hostile takeovers and boardroom battles, but nothing had prepared him for the moral clarity of this soaking wet teenager who stood before him without an ounce of self-pity, only righteous indignation for others. "What do you want, then?" he finally asked, the rain washing away the last of his corporate armor. "I want you to see what you've done. Really see it." Zoe's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion behind her steely exterior. "Not from your boardroom or through some sanitized report from your PR team. I want you to look these people in the eye and understand that your spreadsheets and profit margins have names and faces and dreams that were shattered." Lightning flashed, illuminating her face. Thin, determined, and impossibly young to be carrying such burdens. "And then I want you to fix it. Not just for me. For everyone your decisions hurt. Not charity, Mr. Reed. Justice, responsibility. The things your company's mission statement probably claims to value." As they stood in the rain, Maxwell realized that the check in his hand wasn't a solution. It was just another way of not looking at the true cost of his success. A band-aid on a wound he had inflicted that required far more than money to heal. The paper was already dissolving in the downpour, much like the convenient narratives he had told himself about wealth creation and economic necessity. "You have a daughter?" Zoe said more softly now. "What would you want for her if the roles were reversed? If some man in a tower had decided her future was an acceptable casualty of progress?" And for the first time in decades, Maxwell Reed, the man who had all the answers, had none. The rain continued to fall, washing away pretense and leaving only the raw truth between them. A billionaire and a homeless girl, connected by consequence and standing at the crossroads of redemption. 3 days after the confrontation in the rain, Maxwell sat alone in his home office. The wall of windows overlooking the city skyline, a view he had once considered the ultimate symbol of his success, now seemed to mock him with its distance from reality. Spread across his desk were files, not of profit margins or acquisition targets, but of people. Jenkins had compiled comprehensive information on every employee affected by the Meridian restructuring. Maxwell had spent sleepless nights reading their stories: medical bankruptcies, foreclosures, children withdrawn from college, retirement dreams shattered. Each file contained a photograph, forcing him to see the human cost of decisions he had made with clinical detachment. The face of Elena Winters, Zoe's mother, stared up at him from one of the files. She had been a research chemist, brilliant by all accounts, who had helped develop 3 of Meridian's most successful drugs. Her performance reviews were stellar. She had received the company's Innovation Award twice. And yet, when the algorithm identified departments to cut, her name had appeared on the list, reduced to a data point, a salary to be eliminated from a spreadsheet. Maxwell picked up her employee ID photo. Elena had Zoe's eyes, the same penetrating intelligence, the same quiet dignity. He set it aside, unable to hold her gaze any longer. His phone buzzed. It was Lily. "Dad, did you find her? The girl who helped me?" Maxwell rubbed his temples. "I did. And? Did you thank her? Is she okay?" The innocent questions from his daughter cut deeper than any corporate rival's barbs ever had. "She's surviving, Lily. But no, she's not okay." A pause. "Can we help her?" "It's complicated, sweetheart." "Why?" "You always say nothing's too complicated if you break it down into solvable problems." Maxwell smiled sadly at hearing his own words reflected back at him. He'd built his fortune on that principle, identifying problems, creating solutions, implementing them ruthlessly. But he'd never considered that some problems couldn't be solved with the same tools that created them. Dad? Lily's voice pulled him back. Is it because of us? Something we did? Maxwell closed his eyes. His daughter was perceptive, always had been. In a way, yes. The company I run, we made decisions that hurt her family. Badly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. Then we need to fix it, Lily said finally, with the simple moral clarity that children possess and adults spend lifetimes unlearning. You always tell me we have to take responsibility for our mistakes. When did you get so wise? Maxwell asked softly. I'm just repeating what you taught me, Lily answered. Isn't that what you want? The question lingered long after they'd hung up. Was this what he wanted? A daughter who internalized his words, but not the contradictions between what he preached and practiced? A child who would someday realize her father lived by two separate moral codes, one for family and one for business? Maxwell turned to his computer and began typing. By dawn, he had drafted a comprehensive plan. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could truly undo the damage done. But it was a start. A genuine attempt at atonement rather than a public relations exercise. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Maxwell called his executive team for an emergency meeting. They arrived within the hour, faces concerned as they took seats around his home conference table. His COO, Victoria Chen, was the first to speak. Max, what's going on? The board is already nervous about the quarterly projections, and now this mysterious emergency meeting. I've made a decision, Maxwell announced without preamble. We're establishing the Meridian Restoration Fund, $500 million initially. The stunned silence was broken by his CFO, Richard Barton, who nearly choked on his coffee. Max, that's nearly 20% of our liquid assets. The shareholders will adapt. Maxwell cut in. This isn't charity, it's restitution. He outlined his plan. Comprehensive health coverage for all laid-off employees and their families, retroactive to their termination date. Education funds for their children, job training programs, small business grants, and direct compensation for lost wages and benefits. We'll also be reviewing our acquisition and restructuring policies, Maxwell continued, ignoring the growing looks of alarm around the table. From now on, human impact assessments will carry equal weight to financial projections in our decision-making process. This is unprecedented, his legal counsel, Sarah Goldstein, warned. It admits culpability. The liability implications alone could trigger shareholder lawsuits. We have a fiduciary responsibility to. Then we'll be liable, Maxwell said firmly. Draw up the papers and prepare a statement for the press. No corporate doublespeak, no vague commitments. I want concrete numbers, specific actions, and a clear acknowledgement of our responsibility. Victoria leaned forward. Max, I understand the impulse, but this is an extreme reaction. We could start with something more measured, a foundation perhaps, or enhanced severance packages for future restructurings. I appreciate the concern, Maxwell replied. But this isn't an impulse. It's a correction. We've been measuring success by the wrong metrics for too long. His team exchanged worried glances, seeing a version of Maxwell Reed they didn't recognize. What they couldn't see was the image burned into his mind. A teenage girl standing in the rain, demanding justice with more courage than he had shown in decades of corporate leadership. There's something else, Maxwell added. I want to bring in an outside consultant to help design and implement this program, someone with lived experience of the consequences of our actions. Richard's eyebrows shot up. You can't possibly mean... I do, Maxwell confirmed. Zoe Winters will have a seat at the table. The protests erupted immediately. It was impractical, inappropriate, a potential security risk, a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Maxwell let them voice their concerns, understanding their reaction. Just a week ago, he would have had the same response. When the room finally quieted, he spoke again. I understand your reservations, but consider this. We failed catastrophically in understanding the human impact of our decisions. We need someone who can see our blind spots, someone who won't be impressed by our titles or intimidated by our processes, someone who will hold us accountable. By the time the meeting ended, Maxwell had secured reluctant agreement from his team. They would proceed, not with enthusiasm, but with professional commitment to execute his vision. It was enough for now. Conviction would come later, when they saw the results. As the executives filed out, Victoria lingered behind. This isn't just about corporate responsibility, is it? She asked quietly. Something happened. Something personal. Maxwell considered deflecting, but decided against it. My daughter was being bullied at school. Zoe stepped in to protect her, not knowing who she was. Meanwhile, I was indirectly responsible for destroying Zoe's life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Unconventional, yes. Risky, absolutely. But right. Thank you, Maxwell said, genuinely grateful for the support. I'll need allies in the days ahead. Later that evening, Maxwell drove himself back to the abandoned building. This time, he didn't bring a check. Instead, he carried a proposal, not a handout, but an offer. He wanted Zoe to help design and oversee the Meridian Restoration Fund. Who better to ensure it actually served those in need than someone who had lived the consequences of corporate callousness? The neighborhood looked different in the fading light, less threatening, more weary. People sat on stoops, children played in the narrow spaces between buildings, an elderly man tended to a small container garden on a fire escape. This wasn't just a statistic in an urban poverty report. It was a community, resilient despite the odds stacked against it. As he approached the building, uncertainty gripped him. Would she even listen? Would she believe that a man who had spent a lifetime optimizing for profit could change? Maxwell rehearsed his opening words, then discarded them as insufficient. No carefully crafted speech could bridge the gulf between them. He spotted her through a broken window, sitting cross-legged on the floor, a book open in her lap, a flashlight propped against her shoulder. Even in these circumstances, she was studying. The sight steeled his resolve. Maxwell didn't know if his plan would work. He didn't know if Zoe would accept his offer or throw it back in his face. Both responses would be justified. He didn't know if shareholders would revolt or if his board would eventually force him out. For the first time in his meticulously planned life, Maxwell Reed was walking into a situation without knowing the outcome. And that, he realized as he knocked on the weathered door, was the first step toward becoming the person his daughter, and perhaps even he himself, could truly admire. Not a man with all the answers, but one with the courage to ask the right questions. Not a leader who never failed, but one who acknowledged his failures and worked to make them right. The door creaked open, and Zoe's surprised face appeared in the gap. Their eyes met, the titan of industry and the homeless teenager, connected by circumstance, separated by privilege, and standing at the threshold of possibility. Mr. Reed, she said cautiously, I didn't expect to see you again. I've been thinking about what you said, Maxwell replied simply. And I'd like to talk about how we might fix it. together. The door opened wider, not in welcome exactly, but in willingness to listen. For now, that was enough. 1 month after Maxwell's unexpected visit to the abandoned building, the Meridian Restoration Fund had moved from concept to reality with unprecedented speed. The corporate offices of Reed Enterprises had been transformed, both literally and figuratively. Conference Room C, once used for strategizing acquisitions, was now command central for the restoration initiative. Its walls were covered with maps tracking affected families, charts measuring impact metrics, and photographs of former employees. In the center of it all sat Zoe Winters, directing operations with a quiet authority that belied her 17 years. The healthcare retroactive coverage is encountering bureaucratic resistance, she was saying to the assembled team as Maxwell entered. Insurance companies are claiming they can't process claims from periods when policies weren't active. Victoria Chen nodded, making notes. We'll need to establish a separate entity to handle those directly then. Self-insure for the gap period. Good. And the housing assistance program? A young analyst raised his hand. We've identified 237 families who lost homes due to foreclosure after the layoffs. 83 have since established stable housing elsewhere but remain underwater financially. The remaining 154 are in precarious housing situations. Rentals they can barely afford, doubled up with family members, or worse. What about the Ramirez family? Zoe asked, scanning the data in front of her. They had twins with special needs, as I recall. The analyst shuffled through his papers. They're currently in a 2-bedroom apartment in Westridge. The father is working 2 jobs, and they're behind on rent by 6 weeks. Eviction notice was served last Thursday. Zoe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Prioritize them for immediate intervention. Same for any families with disabled members or children with medical conditions. She turned to another team member. Lisa, can you coordinate with legal to get emergency stays on any pending evictions? We need breathing room while we implement permanent solutions. Maxwell watched from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. The team, a mix of Reed executives and community representatives Zoe had recruited, continued their rapid-fire problem-solving with an energy he hadn't seen in years. They weren't just executing a PR strategy. They were genuinely invested in outcomes. What struck him most was how Zoe had transformed the typically sterile corporate environment. The conference room now featured a wall of impact, photographs and handwritten notes from families who had already received assistance. It wasn't for publicity. It was a reminder of purpose for everyone working on the project. Zoe finally noticed him. Mr. Reed, do you have input on the housing approach? The formality wasn't lost on him. Despite working together daily, she maintained a professional distance, not cold, but careful. Trust would take time. He had earned her collaboration, but not yet her forgiveness. Actually, I wanted to discuss the education fund, Maxwell replied, stepping into the room. I've been meeting with university partners. We have commitments from 17 institutions to honor the scholarships that were abandoned when families could no longer contribute their expected portions. Zoe's expression remained neutral, but she nodded. That's good progress. We should prioritize the seniors who had to drop out mid-degree. They've lost the most time. Agreed. I've also been thinking about your suggestion regarding vocational training. Not everyone wants or needs a 4-year degree. Especially older workers who need to re-enter the workforce quickly, Zoe added. My mother's friend, Mr. Daniels. He was a production line supervisor for 15 years. A certification program would serve him better than starting college at 52. What about apprenticeships? Suggested Rajiv, one of the HR specialists who had volunteered for the task force. We have connections with several trade unions that might be willing to create accelerated programs. Perfect, Zoe said. Can you draft a proposal by Friday? Include projected costs and timelines for implementation. The meeting continued, covering everything from mental health services to childcare assistance for families who had been forced to make impossible choices after losing their primary income. Maxwell was impressed by the comprehensive approach, addressing not just the obvious financial impacts of job loss, but the cascading effects on every aspect of life. When the meeting concluded, he asked Zoe if she had time to talk privately. She followed him to his office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Quite a perspective from up here, she observed, looking out at the urban landscape. You can see everything and nothing at the same time. Maxwell smiled ruefully. An apt metaphor for how I've been running things. He gestured to a chair, and they both sat. On his desk was a framed photograph, new since she'd last been in his office, of Elena Winters accepting her Innovation Award, smiling proudly. Zoe's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her mother's image. Jenkins found it in the company archives, Maxwell explained. I hope you don't mind. It reminds me of what's at stake. Zoe studied the photograph for a long moment. She was wearing the earrings my grandmother gave her, she said softly, almost to herself. She only wore them on special occasions. Then, composing herself, she would be surprised by all this. When she was laid off, she kept saying it wasn't personal, just business. That's what everyone told her. I used that phrase myself many times, Maxwell admitted. It's a convenient fiction we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the consequences of our decisions. And now? Now I understand there's no such thing as just business. Every business decision is deeply personal to someone. Zoe traced her finger along the edge of the desk, considering his words. Do you know what's ironic? My mother defended you, the company, even after everything. She'd say, that's how capitalism works, Zoe. It's not fair, but it's efficient. She looked up at him. Is it, though? Efficient? When you factor in all the hidden costs, the public assistance programs that support laid-off workers, the health crises that send people to emergency rooms because they can't afford preventative care, the lost potential of children who drop out of school to support their families? Maxwell hadn't expected this philosophical turn, but he appreciated her challenging him intellectually as well as morally. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. We've been privatizing profits and socializing losses for so long that we don't even recognize the pattern anymore. Exactly, Zoe said, with the first genuine spark of connection between them. That's what I've been trying to articulate in the impact assessment framework. We need metrics that capture true cost and true value, not just what shows up on quarterly reports. Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss, Maxwell said, steering the conversation back to immediate concerns. The board meeting tomorrow. They're concerned about the scope and speed of the Meridian Initiative. Some are pushing to scale it back, focus only on the most deserving cases, as they put it. Anger flashed across Zoe's face. And who decides who's deserving? The same algorithms that determined which departments to cut? Exactly my concern, Maxwell agreed. Which is why I'd like you to address the board directly. Zoe's expression shifted from anger to surprise. Me? They'll never listen to a teenager. They might not, but they need to hear from you regardless. Maxwell leaned forward. These are intelligent, successful people who have spent decades insulated from the consequences of their decisions, just as I was. They need to see what I've seen. And what's that? That our system isn't just creating wealth, it's creating wounds, and we have a responsibility to heal them. Zoe considered the request, her analytical mind visibly weighing the strategic value against the emotional cost of sharing her story with people who had profited from her suffering. "I'll do it," she finally said. "Not for them, for the families who don't have access to that boardroom." "Thank you," Maxwell replied simply. As she stood to leave, Zoe paused at the door. "My mother kept a journal. After she lost her job, she wrote every day about her job search, her mounting bills, her health concerns. When she got too sick to write, I continued it." She met his gaze directly. "Would that be useful for your board to hear? The day-by-day reality, not just the statistics?" Maxwell felt a tightness in his throat. "Yes, very useful." After she left, Maxwell remained at his desk, contemplating how dramatically his life had changed in just a few weeks. The initial media reaction to the Meridian Restoration Fund had been predictably mixed, praised by some as visionary corporate responsibility, condemned by others as a dangerous precedent that undermined shareholder primacy. Stock prices had fluctuated wildly before settling about 8% lower than before the announcement. Several prominent investors had publicly questioned his judgment. One particularly vocal hedge fund manager had appeared on CNBC declaring that Maxwell Reed had lost his nerve and found religion at shareholders' expense. The business press was divided, with traditional outlets criticizing the initiative, while newer, more progressive publications celebrated it as a potential paradigm shift in corporate accountability. But something unexpected had also happened. Employees throughout Reed Enterprises reported higher engagement and satisfaction. Applications for employment had surged. Several clients had reached out to express support and explore how they might implement similar initiatives. Most surprising was the reaction from a subset of investors, those focused on long-term sustainability and ESG metrics. 3 major pension funds had increased their positions in Reed Enterprises, citing the Meridian Initiative as evidence of forward-thinking leadership that reduced long-term risk exposure. His phone rang. Lily, calling from school. "Dad, I just saw Zoe on campus. Why didn't you tell me she's working with you now?" Maxwell smiled. "It's a recent development. She's helping us with a special project." "She's amazing," Lily gushed. "Everyone's talking about how she stood up to those seniors who were bullying freshmen. The principal actually changed the anti-bullying policy because of her." "That sounds like Zoe," Maxwell replied, thinking how characteristic it was that even while managing the Restoration Fund and dealing with her own precarious situation, she was still fighting for others. "She wouldn't let me thank her again," Lily continued. "She just said anyone would have done the same, which is totally not true. Most people just walked by when those girls were cornering me." Maxwell felt a renewed pang of guilt, remembering that while his daughter had been rescued by a homeless girl, he had been in a board meeting discussing cost optimization strategies, including the very cuts that had destroyed Zoe's life. "Can she come for dinner sometime, please?" "I'll ask her," Maxwell promised, though he suspected Zoe wasn't ready for that level of personal interaction. The professional partnership they'd established was still fragile, built on a foundation of cautious respect rather than forgiveness. After hanging up, Maxwell turned his attention to preparation for the board meeting. He knew tomorrow would be challenging. Harold Winters, the board chairman, had been calling daily, expressing increasing concern about the unchecked expansion of the Meridian Initiative. Several other directors were worried about precedent if they acknowledged responsibility for the human cost of the Meridian restructuring, What about the dozen other companies Reed Enterprises had acquired and optimized over the years? It was a fair question, and one Maxwell had been wrestling with himself. Where did responsibility begin and end? Was there a statute of limitations on corporate harm? He didn't have perfect answers, but he knew that using complexity as an excuse for inaction was no longer acceptable to him. That evening, Maxwell stayed late at the office reviewing data from the first phase of the restoration program. The preliminary results were encouraging. 47 families had received emergency housing assistance, preventing imminent evictions. 32 former employees had enrolled in job training programs. The healthcare retroactive coverage had already paid for critical treatments for 18 individuals who had delayed care due to lack of insurance. It was a drop in the ocean compared to the total need, but it was tangible progress. Real people whose lives were measurably better because of actions taken to correct past wrongs. As he was preparing to leave, Maxwell noticed a light still on in conference room C. He found Zoe there, alone, studying profiles of families scheduled for the next phase of assistance. "It's almost midnight," he said gently. "The work will still be here tomorrow." She looked up, fatigue evident in her eyes, despite her determined expression. "Mrs. Patel's husband needs bypass surgery. Their coverage lapsed 16 months ago when he lost his job in quality control. If we can expedite their case, we will," Maxwell assured her. "First thing tomorrow. But you need rest too." For the first time, he allowed himself to really see her, not just as a symbol of his corporate failings or as an unexpected ally in his redemption project, but as a teenager carrying burdens no child should bear. Despite her remarkable composure and intelligence, she was still so young to have experienced such loss. "Where are you staying now?" he asked carefully, knowing the abandoned building had been condemned 2 weeks earlier. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the default answer of someone accustomed to handling her problems alone. "That's not what I asked." Zoe sighed, relenting slightly. "A friend's couch. It's temporary, but it works for now." Maxwell wanted to offer solutions: a corporate apartment, a stipend for housing, any of the resources at his disposal. But he recognized that her independence was precious to her. It was perhaps the only thing she fully controlled in a life where so much had been taken. "You know," he said instead, "we should be compensating you properly for your work here. The board has approved a consulting contract. The terms are fair, more than fair." "I don't want charity," she said immediately, her guard rising. "It's not charity. It's compensation for expertise that no one else in this building possesses." He placed a folder on the table. "Review it. Negotiate if you want. But don't dismiss it out of principle. The work you're doing has value, and pretending otherwise helps no one, especially not the families you're trying to help." She eyed the folder warily, but didn't reject it outright. Progress of a sort. "Now go get some sleep," Maxwell said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." The next morning arrived with a sense of foreboding. Maxwell had faced hostile takeover attempts and market crashes with less apprehension than he felt walking into the boardroom. The stakes felt higher somehow, not just financial, but moral. The board members were already seated when he arrived, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Harold Winters sat at the head of the table, his silver hair and impeccable suit projecting the authority of old money and established power. "Maxwell," he began without preamble, "we've reviewed the preliminary reports on the Meridian Initiative. The expenditures are concerning, to say the least." "The expenditures are precisely as outlined in the proposal you approved," Maxwell countered calmly. Approved under emotional duress, interjected Douglas Fenton, a director known for his hardline focus on shareholder returns. You presented it as a fait accompli rather than a proposal for proper consideration. Maxwell was about to respond when a knock at the door interrupted them. Zoe entered, carrying a slim portfolio and wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a simple black skirt and white blouse that had once been her mother's. Despite the circumstances, she carried herself with dignity that commanded attention. "Ms. Winters," Harold acknowledged with forced politeness. "We appreciate you taking the time to join us." "Thank you for the opportunity," Zoe replied, taking the seat Maxwell had saved for her. She placed her mother's journal on the table in front of her, a talisman of sorts. "Before we begin," Maxwell said, "I'd like Ms. Winters to share some context that I believe is essential to our discussion." Harold looked as if he might object, but instead nodded curtly. "Proceed, but please be concise. We have a full agenda." Zoe opened the journal, but didn't immediately read from it. Instead, she addressed the board directly. 2 years ago, my mother, Elena Winters, was a senior research chemist at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She had worked there for 15 years and held patents on 3 of the company's most profitable drugs. She was also a single mother who had put herself through graduate school while raising me. Her voice remained steady as she continued. When Reed Enterprises acquired Meridian, the restructuring algorithm identified her department as redundant. She received 8 weeks of severance pay and lost her health insurance. She was 51 years old. One of the directors shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another studied his hands with sudden interest. What the algorithm didn't know, what no one bothered to find out, was that my mother had a pre-existing heart condition. The medication she needed cost $1,742 per month without insurance. Her severance covered less than 2 months of treatment. Zoe finally opened the journal. She documented everything that happened next. On January 12th, she wrote, "Sent out 27 applications today. No responses yet to the previous 43. Trying to stay positive for Zoe's sake, but the industry seems to have an unspoken age cutoff. Younger researchers are cheaper, I suppose." She turned the page. February 3rd. Received another rejection. The position went to someone with fresh perspectives. Code for half my age and salary requirements. Called about pharmaceutical assistance program for my medication. 2-month waiting list for evaluation. I have 3 weeks of pills left. Zoe read entry after entry, chronicling her mother's increasingly desperate situation. The impossible choices, the mounting bills, the deteriorating health, the brave face she put on for her daughter's sake. Her voice remained clinical, detached, as if reading a case study rather than her own tragedy. On March 17th, she wrote, "I'm rationing my heart medication to make it last longer. The doctor would be furious, but what choice do I have? Zoe needs to eat." Zoe's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the journal's edges. By April 8th, "Dizzy spells are getting worse. Tried to hide it from Zoe, but she noticed when I couldn't stand up straight after dinner." The boardroom was silent. These were people accustomed to quarterly reports and market analyses, not the intimate details of suffering their decisions had caused. On May 2nd, she died of a heart attack that might have been prevented with proper medication. I found her on the bathroom floor when I came home from school. Zoe finally looked up from the journal. I was 15 years old. One of the directors, an older woman named Margaret Sinclair, wiped tears from her eyes. Another stared fixedly at the table, unable to meet Zoe's gaze. After her death, I couldn't stay in our apartment. The rent was 3 months overdue, and eviction proceedings had already begun. I lived with a teacher for a while, then a friend's family, then wherever I could. I continued going to school because my mother had valued education above everything. She believed knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you. Zoe closed the journal carefully. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because my mother was one of 5,000. Each with their own journal, written or unwritten. Each with their own story of what happened after they became a line item in a cost-cutting exercise. She placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the center. This contains the preliminary impact assessment of the Meridian Restoration Fund. In 1 month, we've prevented 47 evictions, restored healthcare coverage to 112 individuals, and created pathways back to employment for dozens of former Meridian employees. Her voice took on a new intensity. The fund isn't charity. It's not even justice. It's simply the acknowledgement that corporations have responsibilities beyond quarterly earnings. To the people who build them, to the communities that support them, and to the society that permits them to exist. When she finished, the boardroom remained silent for several long moments. Then Harold Winters cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Winters, for your candor. The board will take your perspective into consideration as we evaluate the program's scope. Maxwell stepped forward. With respect, Harold, I don't think you understand. The Meridian Initiative isn't up for reduction. If anything, it should be expanded. Maxwell, Harold replied with forced patience, we all admire your enthusiasm for this project. But the board has a responsibility to ensure the company's long-term viability. Which is exactly why this matters, Maxwell countered. What kind of company do we want to be? One that measures success solely by profit margins? Or one that recognizes our impact extends far beyond the balance sheet? Douglas Fenton leaned forward, his expression stern. This is precisely the kind of emotional reasoning that concerns us. Business decisions must be based on objective analysis, not personal guilt or social activism. Is it objective analysis to ignore the full costs of our actions? Maxwell challenged. We've been externalizing the true price of our business model for years, pushing costs onto employees, communities, and taxpayers while claiming efficiency. That's not sound business. It's accounting sleight of hand. The debate grew heated, with board members dividing into factions. Some supported the initiative, whether from genuine conviction or recognition of changing social expectations around corporate behavior was unclear. Others remained adamantly opposed, viewing it as dangerous precedent that would erode shareholder value and invite endless claims. Throughout the discussion, Zoe remained composed, answering technical questions about the program with precision and defending its structure with data rather than emotion. Her composure in the face of occasionally condescending questions impressed even her critics. Margaret Sinclair, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke. I've been on this board for 17 years. During that time, we've approved dozens of acquisitions and restructurings. Not once have we requested detailed impact assessments on the human consequences of those decisions. She looked around the table. Perhaps that was a failure of governance on our part. Her intervention shifted the dynamic. As one of the longest-serving and most respected directors, her words carried weight. I propose we continue the Meridian Initiative as currently structured, she continued, with quarterly reviews and transparent metrics. Not just financial metrics, but human ones as well. If we're truly committed to sustainable value creation, we need to understand all dimensions of our impact. Harold looked displeased, but recognized the changing tide. Let's put it to a vote then. By a margin of 7-4, the board approved continuation of the program, with the stipulation of regular reviews and clear success metrics. It wasn't the unqualified victory Maxwell had hoped for, but it was enough to move forward. As the meeting adjourned, Harold approached Maxwell privately. You're playing a dangerous game, Max. The institutional investors are watching closely. If this experiment fails, your position isn't as secure as you might think. I understand the risk, Maxwell replied, but I also understand the cost of continuing as we have been. Just remember, sentiment changes quickly in this business. Today's corporate hero is tomorrow's cautionary tale. With that parting shot, Harold departed, leaving Maxwell to contemplate the precarious path ahead. As he left the boardroom, exhausted but satisfied, Maxwell found Zoe waiting in the hallway. How did it go? She asked. We won. For now. She nodded, unsurprised. This was always going to be a long game. Yes, Maxwell agreed. But for the first time, I think we're playing the right one. As they walked toward the elevator, he noticed she was carrying the consulting contract he had given her the previous night. I've signed it, she said, following his gaze, with one condition. Which is? A portion of my compensation goes into a scholarship fund for children of displaced workers, not just from Meridian, from any corporate restructuring. Maxwell smiled. I think that can be arranged. And I'm going to need a real office, she added. If I'm going to run this program properly, I can't do it from a folding table in the conference room. Done. Anything else? She hesitated, then said, I'd like to finish high school. I've been taking online classes, but with everything happening. Absolutely, Maxwell replied immediately. We'll make sure your schedule accommodates that. Education comes first. Your mother was right about that. The elevator arrived, and they stepped in together. As the doors closed, an unexpected sense of partnership settled between them. Not friendship, not yet, but a shared purpose that transcended their different paths. They were an unlikely alliance. The corporate titan and the homeless teenager, united by a vision of accountability that neither could achieve alone. Lily asked if you might come to dinner sometime, Maxwell mentioned casually as the elevator descended. Zoe looked surprised and then thoughtful. Maybe. Not yet, but maybe. It was a small opening, tentative and uncertain, but it represented the possibility of something beyond their professional collaboration. A hint that the wounds of the past, while never fully healed, might eventually scar over enough to allow for new connections. The elevator reached the ground floor, and they stepped out into the bustling lobby, descending from the rarefied air of the executive floor toward the complicated reality of the world below, where their work was only just beginning. Outside the glass doors of Reed Enterprises, the city stretched before them, a landscape of possibility and challenge, of systemic problems and human solutions. Tomorrow, then? Maxwell asked. Tomorrow, Zoe confirmed with a nod. We have families waiting. 3 months into the Meridian Restoration Initiative, Maxwell Reed sat in his office reviewing the latest impact report. The numbers were encouraging. 412 families had received direct financial assistance. 287 former employees had enrolled in retraining programs, and the retroactive healthcare coverage had paid for critical treatments for over 500 individuals who had delayed care due to lack of insurance. But numbers told only part of the story. The real impact was captured in the testimonials that Zoe insisted on collecting. Not for publicity, but to maintain focus on the human dimension of their work. Without the housing assistance, we would have lost everything, wrote Maria Gonzalez, a former Meridian quality control specialist. My children can sleep without fear now. After 14 months of unemployment, I've finally found work in my field again, reported David Chen, who had completed one of the specialized certification programs. The training made all the difference. Maxwell was particularly moved by a letter from Elaine Patel, whose husband's bypass surgery had been one of Zoe's priority cases. You didn't just save my husband's life. You restored our faith that people in power can sometimes do the right thing, even when nothing forces them to. A knock at his door interrupted his reading. Victoria Chen entered, looking uncharacteristically tense. We have a situation, she said without preamble. The Sentinel is running an investigative piece tomorrow on what they're calling the Reed restoration controversy. Maxwell frowned. The Sentinel was known for its business coverage, particularly its skeptical stance toward corporate social responsibility initiatives, which it often characterized as PR stunts or misguided altruism. What angle are they taking? Victoria handed him a tablet displaying an advance copy of the article obtained by their media relations team. The headline made his stomach tighten. Redemption or Ruin: How Maxwell Reed's Personal Crisis is Endangering Shareholder Value. The article was brutal. A methodical dissection of the Meridian Initiative framed as a reckless, emotionally driven response to personal guilt. It quoted anonymous board members expressing grave concerns about Maxwell's judgment and suggested that major investors were considering action to protect their interests. Most disturbing was a detailed profile of Zoe, including her history of housing instability, a euphemism for homelessness, and what the article described as her outsized influence over a Fortune 500 CEO. It stopped just short of insinuating impropriety, but raised questions about the unusual relationship between the teenage consultant and the powerful executive. This is a hit piece, Maxwell said, anger rising as he scrolled through the article. Who's behind it? We're not certain, but the timing is suspicious. Raven Capital increased their position in Reed Enterprises last week. They now hold nearly 8% of outstanding shares. Maxwell's jaw tightened. Raven Capital was an activist investment firm known for targeting companies they deemed underperforming, acquiring significant stakes, and then forcing leadership changes or corporate restructuring to maximize short-term returns. Their founder, Gabriel Stone, had a reputation for ruthlessness that made even hardened Wall Street veterans uncomfortable. They're laying groundwork for a proxy fight, Maxwell concluded. This article is just the opening salvo. That's our assessment as well, Victoria agreed. Legal is preparing a response, but we should brace for more. If Raven follows their usual playbook, they'll start reaching out to other institutional investors to build a coalition. Maxwell nodded grimly. He had anticipated resistance to the Meridian Initiative, but had hoped for more time to demonstrate its value. Not just in human terms, but in building a more sustainable corporate model. Now it seemed that battle would be fought sooner rather than later. Where's Zoe? He asked. She needs to know about this before it breaks. In conference room C as usual. She's meeting with the education team about the scholarship program. Maxwell found Zoe deep in discussion with 3 education specialists, reviewing applications for the fall semester. She had grown more confident in her role over the past months, developing from a passionate advocate into a skilled program director who could navigate complex systems while never losing sight of individual needs. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing his concern. What's wrong? We need to talk, he said. Privately. The education team discreetly gathered their materials and exited, leaving Maxwell and Zoe alone in the conference room. "There's an article coming out tomorrow," he began, handing her the tablet. "It's not flattering to either of us." Zoe read quickly, her expression hardening as she absorbed the content. Maxwell watched her carefully, concerned about how she would react to having her personal struggles exposed so publicly and her motives questioned so cynically. When she finished reading, she set the tablet down with deliberate calm. "They're trying to discredit the program by discrediting me." "Yes," Maxwell confirmed, impressed by her analytical response. "And by suggesting I'm acting from emotional instability rather than sound business judgment." "The strategy is obvious," Zoe observed. "Undermine the messenger to avoid engaging with the message." She looked up at him. "This is about Raven Capital, isn't it? I've been reading about their tactics." Maxwell shouldn't have been surprised by her awareness. Zoe had proven remarkably adept at understanding corporate politics despite her youth. But her insight still impressed him. "We believe so," he confirmed. "They've acquired a significant position in the company and may be preparing for a proxy contest to replace you with someone who will dismantle the Meridian Initiative and return to business as usual," Zoe concluded. "Someone who prioritizes short-term stock performance over everything else. That's the likely scenario." Zoe was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What's our counter-strategy?" Maxwell noted her use of "our" with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She was already aligning herself with him in this fight, despite the personal cost the article would inflict. "First, we need to prepare you for what's coming," he said gently. "This article will attract attention. Your privacy will be compromised. People may approach you, journalists, investors, even random strangers with opinions about the program." "I can handle that," Zoe said, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face. "What else?" "We accelerate our timeline for demonstrating results. The quarterly impact report was scheduled for next month, but we should release preliminary findings now, especially the data showing improved employee retention and recruitment metrics across Reed Enterprises since the initiative began." Zoe nodded. "The business case. We need to show this isn't just about doing good, it's about doing good business." "Exactly. And we need to rally our allies. There are institutional investors who take a longer view, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, ESG-focused funds. They need to understand what's at stake." "What about the board?" Zoe asked. "Will they stand with you?" It was the question Maxwell had been avoiding. The board's approval of the Meridian Initiative had been tentative at best, with several directors remaining skeptical. If Raven Capital mounted a serious challenge, would they hold firm or abandon the experiment at the first sign of trouble? "Some will," he replied honestly. "Others will need convincing." Zoe's expression turned resolute. "Then we'll convince them. With data, with testimonials, with whatever it takes." Her determination was admirable but also concerning. Maxwell felt a growing sense of responsibility for involving her in what could become an ugly corporate battle. "Zoe, you should know, this could get very personal. They'll dig into your background, your family, anything they can use to discredit you. And by extension, me and the program." "You mean they'll point out that I was homeless? That I lived in an abandoned building? That I've struggled with food insecurity and had to navigate social services that are designed to be impenetrable?" She shook her head. "Those aren't secrets, Mr. Reed. They're the very experiences that qualify me for this work." Her resilience both impressed and saddened him. No teenager should have to develop such thick skin, such ready defenses against the world's cruelty. Still, Maxwell insisted, you didn't sign up for a corporate power struggle. If you want to step back from the public-facing aspects of the program, no one would blame you. Zoe looked at him with something approaching disappointment. Is that what you think I would do? Abandon the work at the first sign of resistance? No, Maxwell admitted. But I wouldn't blame you if you did. This isn't your fight. Isn't it? Zoe challenged. 500 families have received direct assistance because of this program. Hundreds more will benefit in the coming months. If Raven Capital succeeds, what happens to them? The question hung in the air between them, its answer obvious and painful. I'm not stepping back, Zoe declared firmly. If anything, we need to be more visible, not less. The people we're helping deserve to be seen and heard. Their stories are the most powerful counter-argument to Raven's profit-at-all-costs narrative. Maxwell felt a complex mixture of pride, concern, and something else. A growing respect for this young woman, who continued to reveal depths of courage and conviction that belied her years. All right, he conceded, but we do this carefully. No unnecessary risks. Agreed, Zoe said. Now, let's prepare our response. The article drops tomorrow, which means we have less than 24 hours to get ahead of this. They spent the rest of the day in crisis management mode, working with legal, communications, and the Meridian program team to craft responses and prepare supporting materials. Maxwell was impressed by Zoe's focus. Despite the personal nature of the attacks, she remained solution-oriented, even suggesting they release her full background voluntarily to preempt further exposés. If we own the narrative, she argued, they can't weaponize it against us. By evening, they had developed a comprehensive strategy. The company would release a statement addressing the article's mischaracterizations while emphasizing the business case for the Meridian initiative. They would accelerate publication of impact data and launch a series of case studies highlighting successful outcomes. Most boldly, they would invite key institutional investors to meet directly with families who had benefited from the program. As they wrapped up their planning, Maxwell noticed Zoe looking tired, a rare display of vulnerability from someone who typically maintained rigid self-control. You should get some rest, he suggested. Tomorrow will be challenging. Zoe nodded, gathering her notes. I'll be ready. I know you will, Maxwell replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, Zoe, regardless of what happens with Raven Capital or the article or any of it, what you've accomplished with this program is extraordinary. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. She looked up, surprised by the personal nature of the comment. Thank you, she said simply. Then, with characteristic redirection to the work, I'll review the draft statement tonight and send any suggestions. As she left, Maxwell remained in the conference room, contemplating the battle ahead. He had faced corporate challenges before, hostile takeovers, market downturns, competitive threats. But this felt different. The stakes were more personal, the consequences more profound than stock prices or market share. For the first time in his career, Maxwell Reed was fighting not just for control of a company, but for a vision of what that company could be. What business itself could be when it acknowledged its full impact on human lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. Saw online that some investment firm is causing trouble. You okay? Even his daughter was now aware of the brewing conflict. Maxwell texted back, I'm fine. Just business challenges. Nothing to worry about. But as he stared out at the darkening skyline, he wondered if that was true. Was it just business? Or was it something more fundamental? a clash between competing visions of capitalism itself. The next morning, as expected, the Sentinel's article dominated business news. Financial networks featured panels debating whether Maxwell Reed had lost his edge or was pioneering a new model of corporate responsibility. Social media exploded with opinions from across the spectrum, with hashtags both supporting and condemning the Meridian Initiative trending simultaneously. More concerning were the emails from several institutional investors requesting urgent meetings to discuss the company's strategic direction and governance concerns. The battle lines were being drawn more quickly than Maxwell had anticipated. He arrived at the office early, expecting to find crisis management already underway. Instead, he found something unexpected. The lobby of Reed Enterprises was filled with people. Not protesters or journalists, but families. Families holding handmade signs with messages like, "Meridian saved my home," and "My children have health care because of you." At the center of it all stood Zoe, calm and organized, directing people to share their stories with the journalists who had gathered outside. She had orchestrated not a defensive response, but a proactive demonstration of impact, putting human faces to the statistics in their reports. When she spotted Maxwell, she approached with quiet confidence. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I thought it was important for people to see who this is really about." Maxwell looked around at the gathering. Parents with children, elderly couples, young adults in new work attire. All people whose lives had been directly improved by the Meridian Initiative. "It's perfect," he replied, genuinely moved by the display. "This is exactly what we need to show." As they prepared to face the day's challenges together, Maxwell reflected on how far they had come from that rainy night confrontation months ago. They had forged an unlikely alliance that was now being tested by powerful forces resistant to change. The outcome remained uncertain. Raven Capital was a formidable opponent with resources and determination. The board's support was tenuous at best. Shareholders were nervous about anything that threatened short-term returns. But looking at the families gathered in the lobby, people whose lives had been transformed by corporate action, guided by conscience rather than calculation, Maxwell felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was a fight worth having, regardless of the personal cost. As if reading his thoughts, Zoe turned to him with quiet determination. "They think this is about you and me, a CEO's guilt and a teenager's influence. They're missing the point entirely." "Which is?" Maxwell asked, though he already knew the answer. "This was never about us," Zoe said, gesturing to the gathered families. "It's about them. It's about what kind of world we want to build together." With that simple truth as their North Star, they walked together into the gathering storm. An unlikely partnership facing its greatest test, but united in the conviction that business could be a force for healing as well as profit, for restoration as well as growth. The resistance had begun, but so had the revolution.